Hello, my friends. Today, we are going to be talking about how do we go about teaching our kids about money management. I am going to first share the agenda for today's webinar. The first thing that I want to do is introduce myself a little bit. Why am I up here talking about how do we go about teaching our kids about money? And the quick preview is I was a high school math teacher for 9 years. Tell you more about that in a moment. Then we are going to dive into the hero's journey. And as we all know from Joseph Campbell's, famous hero's journey, there are monsters that we face along the way. We're going to talk about some of the ones that we see happening in 2024, 2025 right now. We're then going to do a quick introduction to this idea of money psychology. It turns out that we're human beings. We don't get motivated by, look at this beautiful compounding interest spreadsheet. Doesn't that make you want to take ownership of your finances? No, we are humans. It starts here and it starts here. Then we will be going over a few of the activities that you can use to help teach kids personal finance. And finally, we will wrap things up with some structures. This will get into the idea of buckets. It will get into the purpose of allowance. And of course, we'll talk about the structure of how do we actually deal with the numbers when we do get to that point in our personal finances, because the numbers are extremely important. We just can't dive straight into them and expect that everybody's going to be as excited as somebody like me, a former high school math teacher, would be. So that is where I will start with an introduction to myself. As I mentioned, I was a high school math teacher for 9 years. I started a financial literacy curriculum the first year that I was teaching second semester seniors, because we know all how it goes, right? Seniors get senioritis and they go, when am I ever going to use this? And originally I started teaching them how to use Excel, but I was using all these financial problem sets to do this. And I began to realize that, my goodness, we live in a capitalist society that just throws us to the wolves, financially speaking. We do not get any form of training. There should be an entire high school semester-long course or year-long course, because everybody is going to have to use money. It's the tool that we use in our society to ultimately be able to build the lives that we want to live. So after many years of running this program, you can see over in the corner there, I won an award, the MoneyWiser Financial Innovation Award, as an educator honoree for that. And I began eventually, when COVID hit, to decide that it was time to share this with the world. Other teachers had started coming in, asking to do after school sessions, and it was just clear that there was a need for true foundational financial education and coaching in our community. And so that is how I found my way to On Top Credit Union. Now, I want to give a little bit of the background into credit unions, because this is how I am able to be here doing this. It is the not-for-profit structure of credit unions and also the community chartered structure of credit unions that allows us to be out in our community and serving people in a way that actually helps them to gain confidence with their money management. When we ask people in our society in general, if you were to continue doing what you're doing financially, where would you be in 10 years? We find that people just have no idea. And we believe that helping them to see and plan should be a function of credit unions, because we recognize that although as a not-for-profit, we are able to give lots of those profits that we make back to our members or owners through high yields on deposits, through low rates on loans, we also recognize that nobody ever built a wealthy life by saving 0.5% on an auto loan, right? It's great. I love saving money on my auto loan. And so that's fantastic. But we build our wealthy lives by engaging in ongoing, healthy, positive, productive conversations about our money. And our society does not necessarily support us in doing that. So we are really pleased to be able to do this. As you can imagine, as a credit union, as a not-for-profit, we have incredible products. If you are not a member owner already of OnTap, we highly encourage you, if the next 45 minutes or so is valuable for you, come over, open a free account for you and your kids. If you don't love your bank right now, I think you are going to really like what we have going on and the ability to actually book an appointment with somebody who can help you, whether it's me with some of these financial education topics or whether it's one of our financial advocates for something more technical like an auto loan or even a home loan. All right, let's get into things. We're going to start here because our kids are their own heroes in their money journeys. We are simply the kind and compassionate guides who can help them along the way. But really, everybody needs to have some measure of competency in our finances because nobody can do it for us. When we start diving into the hero's journey, I wanted to highlight just a few things here. And you can see over here, I have Baby Yoda. We are the kind and compassionate guides. Unfortunately, Canva didn't have a full grown-up Yoda picture, so I figured that one would do well enough. But along this journey, I wanted to mention a couple of things. You can see here that Paco de Leon is one of my favorite financial influencers. This is what she calls the pyramid of financial awesomeness. It's from her book, Finance for the People, highly recommended. One of the things that I love to do is to curate resources for people. And this is one that I mentioned just because it really does show the journey. She shows this pyramid, and we're not going to necessarily go down this rabbit hole of what she recommends as being the correct journey for our finances for today, but just know that there are a ton of resources that even for us, as we step into that role of the kind and compassionate guides for our kids, the Obi-Wan of their personal finances, that we can access some of these resources and we can engage in our own hero's journey along the way as well. Now, I did want to talk about some of the monsters along the way for our kids and their hero's journey. The first one is it's 2024, almost 25, and there is comparison in our society. We are all over social media. We see what our neighbors are doing. So perhaps the comparison will come from your kids have friends at school who are going on vacation or who got this or that new toy. We do have to be aware of that in today's world. And there are some ways that we can think about structuring our finances to mitigate that. But it's just one that we have to bring up as a challenge along the way. Another one is digital money. One of the challenging components about teaching kids about money is the fact that you can have it on a card that simply gets swiped nowadays. When we are not exchanging physical money, it becomes more challenging to track because there is this intermediary layer. And this is something that's a challenge for adults as well. This is why I recommend the cash flow system that I recommend. We will talk about that a little bit more later on, but just wanted to highlight that this is another one of the monsters that we'll face. Another one is information overload. We have access to all of the information in the world at our fingertips, it seems, in today's world, and yet much of it may be irrelevant to our purposes, right? It's almost like the information that we actually want gets drowned in a sea of irrelevancy, and we end up having to sort through what is the information that's actually pertinent to me. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but I want to be able to give folks the menu of options out there in this regard and to really clarify some of the reasons that you might want to use this tactic on the menu of options versus this one. The last thing that I do just have to bring up is student loans. So there are many things we could talk about here. Studentaid.gov is a fantastic resource. Please feel free to book me for a session if you and your kids are at a time where this is starting to become a topic of conversation. However, the reason that I also wanted to bring this up is because as a high school math teacher, for as long as I was around and teaching, if there's one thing that I believe about education, it is that brilliance expresses itself in a number of different forms. And we have really tried to make it be only one form, filling in the bubbles on a Scantron test. Well, because of our kind of history as a society, we have really pushed post-secondary education, college, and there are a lot of opportunities, especially today, that are emerging in other fields. If our kids really excel in the visual world or in the physical world, working with their hands, and they never really liked school, it may be worth considering what it might look like to check out some of the fantastic schools that we have in the trades world now. We have Warren Tech as a world-class technical high school that a student in Jefferson County can attend even while they attend their normal homeschool. And of course, we also have a number of excellent technical post-secondary education options as well that don't cost the same amount as your traditional post-secondary education options. So lots more to be said on that, but please feel free to reach out and we can have more conversations on that front. Okay, now let's jump into this idea of understanding our money psychology, because this becomes a very important component to the conversation. I mentioned it earlier, but as a former high school math teacher, right, I always just wanted to show people that beautiful compounding interest spreadsheet. And it turns out that we really start here and we start here. There were two economists named Kahneman and Tversky, who eventually kind of turned the world of economics on its head by saying, hey, people, like human beings do not, as economists have said for a long time, analyze every single piece of information in front of them and come to the decision that most maximizes their economic utility. Like, no, we do make decisions, especially our money decisions, sometimes emotionally. So one of the favorite quotes that I have is from Carl Jung, the great psychologist. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate. And when we are having conversations about money with our kids, this is important for us to even understand some of our own money psychology that comes into the picture. So I like to do this quick activity with folks. If you do it with me, basically you're going to close your eyes and I'm going to just warm us up with a couple of examples before we get to the real point of this activity. So close your eyes. Imagine that you're in your car, you're driving out of your neighborhood or wherever, and you pull up to a stop sign. So look up to the right at that stop sign and tell me, what color is it? You can just call it out where you are now. And many people will, of course, call out that the stop sign is red. But this is why I wanted to do this activity. It's a little bit of a trick because stop signs are red and white, right? And so let's do one more warm up and then we'll get to the point of this activity. So let's choose another road sign, and you can close your eyes if you want to. Again, visualize a yield sign and call it out. What colors are the yield sign? And if you are like most people, you just called out that the yield sign is yellow and black. But yield signs are red and white, right? If you are like what I find, if I'm speaking to an audience of, let's say 50 people, I often find there's maybe 1 to 3 people in the crowd that don't call it out immediately. They hear lots of people say yellow and black, and they're over there like, red and white, right? Because they're thinking about it. What's happening here is exactly what Kahneman and Tversky described. We create mental shortcuts as human beings because if we analyze every single piece of information, it takes a lot of energy, right? For those people who are probably very visual, who did call out that the yield sign's red and white, they probably had to envision it, and that takes more mental energy to do instead of just taking the priming that I gave of all of these other types of yield signs and going, oh yeah, all other types of signs are yellow and black, right? So this is some of the ways in which we make decisions, and this plays into how we decide to manage our money. My suggestion here is really ultimately, as you'll see when we get to the numbers, to create systems that are somewhat like bumper lanes that allow us to really learn how we make decisions emotionally sometimes, and that's totally okay. But we can start to identify some of the times in which we make those decisions emotionally in a way that is maladaptive, that doesn't actually help us in the long run. Now, a couple more things to say on this idea of money psychology. One of them is, what is your perspective on money? How do you see it? And so you can see there's a couple of questions here that maybe you can reflect on yourself. But the point here is that everybody comes to money from a different perspective. And it's not just, did we grow up without money or did we grow up with an overabundance of money? Of course, we are going to see it in a different way if we grew up in one of those circumstances. But we could have been anywhere along the spectrum of income, and we could still see money as being the root of all evil, right? The thing that makes corporations do unethical things. Or we might have grown up in an entrepreneurial family, again, anywhere along the spectrum of income, and we could see money as the value exchange that I get when I do good in the world. Those are completely different thoughts and angles on the same thing. And again, this thing is just a tool that can allow us to live the lives that we want to live. So that's really where we start. And I wanted to briefly discuss this idea that comes from Dr. Brad Klon's on invisible money scripts. So if I grew up hearing over and over again, money doesn't grow on trees, money doesn't grow on trees, then I'm probably more likely to feel guilty when I spend my money on myself, right? And you can see there's a whole range of different invisible money scripts that we can see listed on the page here. We're not going to go into all of them, but just as a quick other example, another type of thing that we might hear in our society is when something costs a lot. I've heard, it costs an arm and a leg. Like, really? We got to be giving up our limbs to get money? That's the importance of it? Like, why do we say these types of things, and how does that influence how we perceive money? Another one that we might hear out there is, something to the effect of more money, more problems. Why not more money, more opportunities, right? Like, these are the phrases in which, if we become aware of kind of how we come to money, what perspective do we have, we can begin to really influence the conversations a little bit better. And along these same lines, I do want to talk briefly about the fact that I think so much traditional financial advice in our society comes from this idea of, budgeting, and you got to get really restrictive with your expenses, and you have to track every single penny and spend time on that. That's what good money management is. And it's like, to what end? One of the principles that I think comes from psychology and is very important for us in developing a more positive relationship with our money, and therefore passing that on to our kids as well, is we have to stop living by a memory of the past, which is often what traditional budgets do. And instead, we have to start to live by a vision of the future. And we have to get really specific with that vision. And this is where, when we get to the numbers, the cash flow plan, the cash flow system that I recommend for folks, it is a spreadsheet, but it really helps us to clarify our view, to see the playing field, and then begin to define that vision of the future and automate some of the pieces of our money that will allow us to get there. And in these regards, I want to state that getting started is more important than becoming an expert. And so that is hopefully just a bit of encouragement. Please reach out. I do one-on-one coaching sessions with folks all the time. I do one-on-one sessions just to simply share resources and let folks know about how might this idea or that idea fit into your own money management systems. So please reach out in that regard. I want to talk, before we get into some of the systems and structures, about some activities that can help to teach finances. Now, these are pretty easy to dive into because they are freely available online. These actually come from an organization that I used to work pretty closely with when I was a high school teacher. They're doing a fantastic job. It's called Next Gen Personal Finance, or NGPF. And their goal is really to teach more teachers how to teach personal finance, and then hopefully get more personal finance courses in more high schools. So it's a fantastic mission, and I still am very supportive of what they do. The first activity that I think is just so fun for many of our kids, you can even do this in a group, is called Build Your Stacks. And you can find it at buildyourstacks.com. Notice that stacks is spelled with an X. Really, what this simulation does is it goes through 20 years of time, and it takes real historical data from some period of the US stock market, the US economy, and we don't know what the period is until we get to the end of the simulation. But what happens is kids can begin to, they're going to get paid every single month. And so their pocket cash, you can see over in this side of the simulation, begins to go up. And then they need to manage their pocket cash amongst a number of different options. So they can store it in a savings account. They can utilize a certificate of deposit. Our certificates of deposit on tap right now are excellent. They can put it into an index fund. They can put it into individual stocks. And these stocks actually represent real US company stocks. And then they could also use government bonds or commodities. And sometimes the commodities will be cotton, sometimes it'll be gold. And basically what happens is by the end of this 20 years, we are competing against, maybe we're competing against our friends in a small group. You can set it up that way, but we're also competing against the computer. And the ultimate point is that the computer doesn't actually have any information that we don't have. It just uses one particular strategy, which is it puts all of its income into the standard index fund. And then we get to compare and contrast how did we do as compared to the computer. So it ends up being a really fun simulation. In this example session, the data was actually from 1993 to 2013. And you can see that they've disguised the stock names. In reality, MP Technologies was actually IBM. Machines R Us was GE. So it's kind of fun to begin to have some of these discussions with really high school aged kids. Typically, we could even start this type of a simulation as early as middle school. Generally, elementary school is a little bit early for this type of a simulation. However, there's a great one, especially for younger students. Actually, this one really scales all the way up through high school, called Money Magic, where we are in this simulation an entrepreneur who is building a magic business, a traveling magic business. And we have to manage some of our expenses for if we want to grow or produce another show versus our income from each one of the shows. So this one ends up being a really fun simulation for teaching this idea of cash flow and also entrepreneurship in some senses. There's another one that is kind of fun, especially in today's world, called Influenced, where really the simulation is imagining that you become a social media influencer. And it really goes through some of the dynamics for how hard is it to actually become a, YouTube star or an Instagram or TikTok star and make money from it. Many of our kids imagine, doing something like that. And this gives some further insights into what are the dynamics behind what that would actually look like in real life. So another fun one from this perspective. Okay, now I do want to dive into some structures. Plus, here come the numbers. Dun, dun, dun. Before we dive fully into the numbers, I got to describe a little bit of background. There is an issue that comes up with the numbers often, and that is overwhelm. And this is across the board. It's everybody from engineers to accountants and artists and creatives. Everybody tends to struggle with the numbers. It just tends to happen in different ways. So some people who maybe are a little bit more number averse, they end up just kind of trying not to think about it and just hope that it all works out or future me will handle it, right? And on the other hand, some of our more number-philic folks, whether it be an engineer or a scientist, they tend to obsess over the numbers and make it far too complicated, such that we can't actually fulfill all of the lofty goals that we have for managing every single thing. And so really, this is where, as we'll see, the cash flow system that I generally recommend is meant to give us a 30,000-foot view of the playing field, but allow us to not have to spend all of our time and energy tracking every expense. One more note that I want to talk about before we get fully into this is, as a former high school math teacher, I saw a lot of different techniques for teaching math. And the traditional way that we learn something like multiplication is, especially for folks who are my age or older, we tended to learn multiplication through route memorization. We had a table with only numbers on it, and we had to basically memorize it. And maybe we got some games or something like that that helped us, but generally the technique was memorization. Well, there are other ways to teach mathematics, and one of them is called manipulatives. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but when I do explain this to people who are visual learners, they're like, oh my goodness, I can imagine that if I had learned multiplication through manipulatives, I would have seen it in a completely different way. I would actually visualize things in my mind, and that would give me the answer. And so the only point there, without going into too much more detail about the ways in which we learn, is that I find this also happens in regards to budgeting. I think that this is going to be a different potential style of learning that I'm going to describe in a bit. And really, that is my goal, right? Is to show you the menu of options out there. My approach is to empower, not to prescribe. So I want to show you what is possible out there, talk about some of the pros and cons of each of the different systems, and then ultimately give you a hammer, give you a tape measure, give you a tool belt, and you're going to decide what it is that you want to build with the tools that you have in front of you. So I've listed, you can see a couple of different strategies up there, 50, 30, 20, FIRE, rich dad, poor dad. Like, what are the things that we might want to use that might fit with our lives? Those are the types of things that I really like to begin to discuss. So again, feel free to meet with me afterwards if you have any particular things that you wanted to talk through, but I'm going to show you a couple more ways that you might have not previously thought about the menu of options out there. And the first one is I want to talk about some systems. And when it comes to allowance, this is a system that many parents will use. And one alternative in the menu of options out there as for a way to think about allowance is to ask the question, what is it for? And to get really clear when it comes to what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish with allowance. Well, I think many folks think that allowance is a way for kids to learn that you got to earn your income. And so they will get an allowance if they do all of their chores or something like that. For me, I prefer to think about it in a very different way. And this could be part of your menu of options out there to consider, is I believe that allowance is more about teaching kids how to use and become responsible with money. And therefore, it doesn't need to be chore-based, because that lesson, though very important, is a different lesson. The point then of allowance is to really get them used to this idea that every single dollar can have a different job, and we need to assign what that job is early on. And this is where, as you can see, we can really start to come up with the bucket analogy. Now, this is going to be highly individualized. So again, I encourage you, if you're thinking about systems that will work for your kids in particular, to book a conversation with me and let's discuss what might work best for you. But some of the structures that we can use with allowance to set things up are our kids will get an allowance every week or every month, no matter what, and they need to, in terms of structures, begin to get used to putting it into different buckets. Each dollar is assigned and it's based off of a percentage. And so one of those buckets can be called the spend smart bucket. Or as you'll see in the cash flow system that I use, I've adopted this term, the guilt-free spending number. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But that spend smart bucket is really for us to be able to, for our kids to be able to use money on the things that they want to use it on now. And as you can imagine, that also takes some advanced planning if they are responsible for things like going to Starbucks, which I know many parents who just, are like, oh my goodness, I give my child $5 every day or once a week to go to Starbucks or whatever it is. And I wonder how much they actually end up spending there by the end of the month. Or whether it's some of those bigger things that our kids want that oftentimes we end up just buying for them, it causes them to have to think about, do I want the Starbucks on a daily basis, or do I want the big item, the remote control car, the video game system, whatever it is? And if that's the case, I really need to do some planning to be able to get there. The second bucket is that save bucket. And so this is where, it depends on how we want to set things up, but that save bucket could be for some of those items like that car, that video game system. And our kids will have to determine what percentage is going towards the save versus the spend smart in order to achieve that goal that they have for the bigger item. Of course, there is an invest bucket. We want to be teaching our kids early about what investments are. And please feel free to reach out if you have questions on specifics of, how do Roth IRAs work or things like that. I can point you to all of the right resources there. Roth IRAs are a fantastic tool for helping us to teach our kids in these regards. And there are some setup that in the back end that is necessary. So I can describe that 30,000 foot view for you. And then finally, not all parents, but many parents may want to have some sort of a share bucket. And that could be for teaching kids early that being generous with our money is a money dial that can really light us up. And so this can create really cool conversations of, whether it's tithing or whether it's what nonprofit do we want to contribute to this year on Colorado Gives Day or whatever the case is. This can create some really cool family conversations. Not everybody will end up using a share bucket, but many folks find it to be really fun to have those conversations with their kids. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about some of these structures. I'm going to talk about the numbers first before I actually give a description of cash flow, because I do think the description of it is important to know how we learn. But let's start with kind of how we structure things in the cash flow plan that I make freely available to all of our members. What we do is we basically take the standard 50-30-20 principle, which is a very common principle within the world of personal finance, and we're going to slightly adapt it because it makes a lot more sense to have the numbers slightly changed for today's world. Now, I'm talking about this more from the perspective of adults. Like, this is the system that can really help us as adults to simplify our own finances. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is because as you'll notice, it's a very similar system where we have different buckets that we're using. The reason that this system isn't completely applicable to our kids is because many kids don't have to pay rent, right? And some certainly do contribute to some portion of rent, and there are systems that we can use to set that up in a way that works for each family. But that's really the distinction here, is I just wanted to give this background. So what we do is, instead of taking the 50% from the 50-30-20 principle, which that 50% is typically called needs, we're going to change the term a little bit, and we're going to call it living expenses. And we're going to change the percentage to be between 50 to 60% of take-home pay. Now, this is really a goalpost for us as adults. If I'm younger in my career, I may have a living expense ratio of 70%. And that is going to put stress on other parts of my financial life, but I don't have to change it immediately. Maybe I can. And this is the beauty of having the spreadsheet that I offer, is we don't have to go out there and actually make the change. We can see, hey, this is erasable. Like, what if I just changed the number here on my spreadsheet for my housing expense or my grocery bill? Like, how big of a difference would that make? Whoa, it makes that difference? Or, oh, it makes that difference? Well, I'm not going to do that, or I am going to do that. But the point is that in the long term, it could also give us a goalpost where if we're young and we expect our income to continue to increase, maybe that's how we're going to get below that 60% living expense ratio over time. Lots of discussion really is necessary here. So again, book me for a session and we can talk through your plan or example plans that I give people kind of an idea of how I might go about thinking about a particular situation in a total scenario situation, but that they can apply to their own scenarios as they're learning how to use this cash flow plan. The second category, as you can see, is savings, which is 5 to 10% of take-home pay. This is really differentiated from investments because savings are for the shorter term goals, whereas investments are for the long term. We're thinking about those if we are, 30 years old, we're thinking about 35 years down the line with those investments, whereas savings may be a long-term emergency reserve that will help us should something go wrong. But it could also be, once I have my long-term emergency reserve funded, maybe I have savings goals for the vacation that I want to take next year. Notice how this is similar to that same thing we're doing with our kids if they want to buy that RC car or the video game system or whatever it is. We have to do some planning for how we're actually going to get there. Then we have investments, which the goal for us as adults is to hit 10% of take-home pay. And again, this is where a Roth IRA can come into play. If your kids work and earn income, then a Roth IRA could be a really amazing investment idea early on. But again, there is that idea of they have to earn income in order to be able to contribute to a Roth IRA. Please feel free. I can send you some resources that dive more into Roth IRAs and explain the 30,000-foot view of them for you after this session if you're curious about that. And finally, for adults, this is really where things get fun. In the 50-30-20 principle, the 30% is recommended to be our wants. Well, I have called this different terms over the years. I've called it the fun and BS account, but I really love this term, which comes from a very highly recommended financial guru named Ramit Sethi. He calls this number the wants number. He calls it our guilt-free spending number, which I think is brilliant because how many of us feel guilty when we spend on ourselves today? But when we actually can see the playing field through this type of a plan, and we've already planned for the future because we know what our savings and investments are, and we set those up as automated monthly contributions to those accounts, well, then I know what my guilt-free spending number is every single month. And that allows me to track it without actually having to go and track every single detail. There's a way that we're able to do an account setup where we can just send that into a guilt-free spending account automatically every month. And then we kind of know where we're at each month. And this is where I did want to talk a little bit more about cash flow, because really the goal here for me, oops, I'm knocking stuff over in my room. The goal here for me with cash flow is, first of all, it's the lifeblood of our finances. And so we do want to fight for simplicity here. But there's an important concept that comes from education within this. And what I'll say first is that when it comes to cash flow, like, I personally want to be able to get a little loose with my money and to again, not have to track every single expense. But the thing to note here is that what often happens for people is we start trying to track our cash flow or manage our cash flow by playing by feel, playing kind of just up here. And that can kind of make sense as to why we do that, because the equation for cash flow is pretty simple on the surface level, right? We have income and we have expenses plus savings, and that's kind of it. But if you think about the math behind what's happening when it comes to cash flow, it's actually really complicated, because for many of us, our income can be going up and down. Maybe we get a bonus, maybe we're an entrepreneur and we have a completely spiky variable income. And for pretty much all of us, our expenses can fluctuate slightly. And so this is like one of those math problems where you have a bucket filled with water and there's water coming in, but the rate at which it's coming in is fluctuating, and water going out, and that's also fluctuating. Well, the math there is really challenging math. It's differential equations, which is insane. That was the hardest class I took in college, I think. And yet many of us are trying to play by feel. And so I am not suggesting that what we need to do is understand how differential equations work and get really into our cash flow from that perspective. But instead, what I think we are able to do is we can set up bumper lanes for ourselves that allow us basically to begin to learn how cash flow works, so that we can get to a place where we can get a little bit more loose with it. Now, the analogy here is if I'm teaching somebody how to ski, then I'm not going to start them off with a jump where they're going to do a 360 spin, right? Or with the basketball, I'm not going to start them off teaching them how to dribble with a spinning through the legs juke, right? we are going to focus on the fundamentals. We're going to focus on, in the skiing world, on focusing on only one edge at a time. So we're making this turn on one edge and then we're switching over to the other. Or with the basketball, we're dribbling just with our right hand and then with our left hand, and then we're adding in a crossover. What happens here is that in the English language, we only have one word for to know. Oh, I know something intellectual, or I know how to dribble the basketball. Well, in other languages, there's more than one word for it. Like in German, there's two words, Kenntnis und Wissenschaft. There's to know intellectually, and there's to know through experience. And that is what we are trying to develop with our cash flow. By doing some of these systems that act as a bumper lane or act as a drill for dribbling the basketball, what we're doing is we're allowing ourselves to understand intellectually what's happening with cash flow, but we are getting to the point where we just know what's happening because we've created those systems and structures that allow us to get there. Now, there's a few more pieces that come into play whenever people are getting to the point of getting to this cash flow spreadsheet that I have. One of them is that calculating your living expenses turns out to be a really challenging problem within personal finance. And there is a solution here, which is that OnTap's mobile app is actually a fantastic, it's my one-stop shop for all of my financial needs. It lays everything out in a very organized way, and you can customize the different categories such that they line up with these categories exactly in terms of your savings accounts, your investment accounts, your credit card spending accounts, if you use the intermediary layer of credit cards. Now, the thing to note is that for some people calculating living expenses, it might actually be valuable for you to do the old school method, to pull, your last 3 months of credit or debit card statements and to go in and manually highlight every time you're spending money on groceries, every time you're spending money on gas, to figure out, hey, what's my average amount per month that I spend on those particular categories? But our app can fast track that. And we actually have a YouTube video, if you want to check it out, that gives a quick introduction to how to do that. Again, feel free to book me for a session and I can show you more about how to do that as well. Now, when it comes to seeing the playing field, this is the cash flow spreadsheet that I like to use. I'm not going to go into too much depth for right now because, again, we're really hoping to focus on teaching our kids about money management here. But the first step to being able to teach our kids is for us ourselves to become confident with money. And we become confident with our money by developing competence with our money. And this is how we see the playing field. So I'm not going to go into the actual explanation and descriptions of this cash flow spreadsheet, but please grab a copy of it. I have designed it to where now you can see in this, at the bottom here, there's 3 different pages. Well, there is the first page that links to an introduction video, which is kind of a little bit behind. It's like right next to where I am right here. Right down there. And then you'll see that the second page is the spreadsheet itself, and then the last page has some resources. I'm going to continue adding to that resources page, but right now it already links to several videos that describe some of the concepts that can help you to understand this spreadsheet and to use it well. I also just have to mention that this is really the system that we're hoping to create. And this is the system that I would recommend for folks as they're getting to the point where they have this intuitive understanding of cash flow. Really, what this means is we are direct depositing a paycheck into our cash flow account. Of course, if you have access to a 401k, that comes off the top already. And there are ways to plug that into the spreadsheet. I can talk about those with folks. But this is an important concept, especially to teach high school to college age kids. I can remember when I got my first job and had access to a 401k, I didn't know how much to contribute. And so I basically got some advice. Like, for example, I was told, well, if your employer has a match, then you should take that match. At least that's free money. And so I think my first employer match was 3% or something like that. And of course I took that match, but I never thought to go back in later on when I realized that I had extra room in my cash flow plan and readjust it to fully fund a 401k up to the IRS limits of what was possible. If you want to talk about that, again, book me for a session. We can go into more depth there, but I just do think that that's an important concept to be talking about with high school to college age kids, certainly, especially as they're getting ready to potentially have a job that might have access to a 401k. Now, when the direct deposit goes into the cash flow account, basically what you'll see here is that we partially automate all of our living expenses. So of course I can automate things like rent. I can't automate things like groceries or gas money. That's where I have to do that calculation for what are my living expenses. And of course there's also a layer here of credit cards. Now, not everybody wants to or even should use credit cards. A debit card can be a fantastic tool. And in general, that is one that we should be teaching to our younger kids, certainly, how to do debit card management in a similar way to how we do it ourselves with some of these structures. But it's also important, I think, to teach about some of the ideas behind credit cards. We all know that the credit card companies know our psychology and they offer all sorts of points that, let's say you earn 2% rewards or something like that, or even not worse, but like psychologically more tricky airline miles or something like that, where it's not a direct conversion that we can do in our heads. Well, credit card companies know that that seems attractive to us. And so if we ever let interest accrue on a credit card, it is not worth whatever points or rewards they are offering us, right? And I can show you the math on that front, but this is another piece that can be really valuable to talk about with our kids depending on where they're at. I'm not going to necessarily talk about that with elementary to middle school kids, but certainly with high school and definitely college age kids, we're starting to have some of those discussions. The second thing that I'll say about this cash flow account is then we automate our contributions into our savings account and into our investment accounts based on the percentages that we've outlined on our spreadsheet. And finally, we know our guilt-free spending number. And so based on that number, let's say that my guilt-free spending number comes out to $500 a month or $1,500 a month, whatever it is, I can automate that amount into a second cash flow account. And when I'm saying cash flow account, I'm really meaning checking accounts. We just don't use checks anymore. We do cash flow management. So I think it's funny that we still call these things checking accounts sometimes. To me, they're cash flow accounts. And so that main one is allowing us to then send whatever our guilt-free percentage, whatever that amount of money is per month, into a separate guilt-free spending account. And that's why I don't have to track what is my fun money versus what's not. That is on a different account, different card, and therefore I can check that easily on my mobile app through the month to see where I'm at. And that's where I don't have to go back in and manually be tracking every single expense that I have. I also mentioned over here that there is a planning tool available to us. This really can help us to figure out what expenses are coming up and really learn how to manage cash flow as we're getting that intuitive feel for it. I still do this myself every month. I do it about twice a month just to see where I'm at, but I don't use the planning tool anymore. I can do it more intuitively by looking at my phone calendar, doing some planning along with my mobile app, and it works out quite well. All right, that is everything that I wanted to be discussing for now. As you can tell, this is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of this conversation, and we've gone for almost an hour already. Beyond this point, I think it's really important to dive into some of the specifics for each individual family, each kid. Sometimes within one family, if we have multiple kids, they can be completely different with the way that they interact with money. And so these are where some of the individual one-on-one calls and coaching sessions that we offer here at On Top come in really handy. Let's hop on the phone and chat through some of the specifics of what you see with your own kids, and we can share further ideas within the menu of options out there for how do we go about thinking, how do we teach our kids about personal finance, as well as, if we want to, continue to become even further experts ourselves. Because remember, getting started is more important than becoming an expert. And for ourselves, we teach our kids best about money when we become confident ourselves with money, which happens through becoming competent with the numbers and with our own perspective on money. I have a huge favor to ask you, which is right in the middle of the screen there. That QR code will go to a survey link that I believe is still live and running. If you don't mind, I would love to hear your thoughts on this presentation. Was this of value to you? It asks just a couple of yes or no questions and then gives 1 or 2 chances for a free response. I would love to hear your thoughts. And then if you'd like to book an appointment with me, that link or that QR code on the left is where you can book an appointment. The QR code on the right is where you can get my free guide to the top 5 money hacks to help you develop a more positive relationship with your money. And that also has a link within it to the cash flow spreadsheet that we discussed earlier. And of course, please connect with me on LinkedIn. Send me a message through LinkedIn. Send me an email. My email is just mmoore, MMOORE at ontapcu.org. And I would love to send any of these resources as well as chat further about what could be useful for you, your kids, and your own money management and your life. Have a great day, you all.